Messianic I and Rastafari in New Testament Dialogue. Bio-Narratives, the Apocalypse, and Paul's Letter to the Romans by Delano, Vincent, Palmer. Prologue. A. Purpose. A perennial problem in New Testament NT studies is the determination of the significance of the emphatic first-person pronoun in Romans 7:14-25. Since the Reformation period, several proposals have been made to understand this particular pericope, but to date there is still no scholarly consensus. A corollary to this is that very little attention has been paid to Chapter 15, a part of the final section, which is considerably more important than many have implied, and where Paul also makes use of the I in a seemingly theologically significant way. I am particularly interested in the way in which this pronoun is employed in much of the NT, and by a religious group, the Rastafari, which claims continuity with the NT Messianic community as a whole. In this connection, the following questions will be addressed. 1. What can we say about the relevant Messianic dominical I sayings found in the Gospels? 2. What are the intertextual links and functions of the I statements in the 2 chapters of Romans mentioned above? And 3. Can any parallel be drawn between the language of Rastafari and such NT Messianic I sayings? This last question may prove to be critical to my investigation, since as yet there is no adequate explanation of the prominent place of the I in Rasta theology, Christology. Could it be that the Messianic I of the NT has influenced Rastafari, given the veneration of Selassie as the Christ? And how does one account for the Pauline I vis-a-vis the Jesus tradition preserved in the Gospels and elsewhere? Is there a connection here as well? While these questions may be considered to be important in their own right, they will not be allowed to eclipse the overall objective of this study as outlined above. In other words, the main purpose of this book is to critically compare first-century uses of the Messianic I as found in the NT with that of contemporary Rastafari. B. Approach. The NT is not a monolithic piece in terms of its literary constitution. It is made of 3 main genres, the first of which, to go by the canonical order, is gospel. In this broad literary form is found quite a number of the phenomenon that is chosen for scrutiny. Over the years, several tools have been designed to study the 4 documents that fall under the rubric of gospel, and each of the documents presents its own hermeneutical challenge. What then is the best approach to the study of the Synoptics and the Corpus Johanneum, Johannine literature? And what about Paul's letter to the Romans? In the last century, N.T. Wright published his first tome of an ambitious 6-volume project that seeks to reassess the full gamut of Christian origins. Wright begins by carefully setting out his methodology, which seeks to avoid radical postmodern approaches on the one hand and naive modernistic historical reconstruction of the NT genres on the other. He opts for what he calls critical realism, an approach that investigates the theological posture of a group by way of its dominant story, praxis, and worldview. A modified form of this critical or practical realism, employed also by Dunn, will be adopted here. Today, the NT student has a wealth of approaches from which to draw in addressing questions like those outlined above. In light of this, it may not be prudent to rule out of hand any tool that might be deemed legitimate. This is an advantage of Wright's approach. In such a pursuit, however, one would need to recognize the limitations of the tools themselves as well as the situatedness of the personal I that attempts to carry out the investigation. In this regard, a Caribbean theologian reminds the NT interpreter that she or he does not have access to what he calls the primary version of the biblical text, the live, existential, and dynamic revelation that the biblical writer or speaker received. And though it is believed that much of this was captured in the earliest manuscripts, we today have to be content with copies of these. Consequently, we are left without the immediate knowledge of all the intricacies, inferences, innuendos, and multiple meanings of the biblical text. It is therefore critical that the interpreter should demonstrate familiarity with the languages and ideological concepts derived from the world of the text. On this level, as well, a kind of hermeneutics of suspicion is introduced. This is considered crucial in the use of modern translations done exclusively by people of other orientations, thus necessitating a rereading of the primary documents to more effectively bring the horizon of the hearer or reader into conversation with the text. I have already mentioned the kind of comparison that will be pursued, the pronominal I of the New Testament with that of Rastafari. This will, at first, involve what may be called an intratestamental dialogue before the substantive task comes into focus. Although it is nigh impossible to reconstruct the precise chronological framework of the NT documents, the general consensus of NT scholarship is that the Pauline letters preceded the material containing dominical sayings. This consensus, however, does not preclude and in any way jeopardize a basic canonical approach to frame the study. In the authorized version, for a long time the preferred Bible of Rastas, there are more than 1,000 statements in the Gospels and the Apocalypse that contain the pronominal I. Approximately 700 of these are attributed to Jesus. Therefore, when the Rasta reads from the Synoptics, and especially the two main pieces of the Johannine corpus, the Fourth Gospel and the Book of Revelation, she or he is bound to be confronted with what one may call a battery of I words. This study will not be examining all of these I statements. It will instead work with that portion of the 347 occurrences of ego, which is deemed Messianic, dominical, as well as the Pauline I in the book of Romans. Limiting the investigation in this way allows me to concentrate on what Kümmel considers to be the main witnesses of the NT, the very ones in whose writings are to be found, arguably, the richest quarry of I statements. With the possible exception of the Pauline material, these are presumed to be the best samples available to carry out a comparative analysis. The following reasons may further be adduced. The I of revelatory discourse is found in the NT above all, in John, Revelation, and in manifestation narratives in the Gospels and Acts. The I in NT revelatory discourses are almost always spoken by Christ. Self-revelation by God occurs only seldom in the NT. This study will therefore focus attention on those instances in which, 1, the pronominal I is cited in the literature of Rastafari, and or 2, where the I appears useful to illustrate the rich tapestry of the said discourse. C. Motivation. The Rastafari movement, as far as I know, is the only professedly Christian group that employs the pronominal I in such a distinctive manner. This I find intriguing. The fact that a similar phenomenon is found in their main religious documents is even more interesting. Such matters, in my view, warrant investigation. By comparing the results drawn from the NT data with the permutations of I within Rastafari, this study seeks to make a contribution toward the development of an Anglophone, Creole-speaking Caribbean NT theology, which is now emerging. Because of its unique historical experience and its continuing search for identity in that context, the Caribbean theological pursuit gains authenticity from being rigorously contextual. In light of this, not a few English-speaking Caribbean theologians have singled out the reasonings of Rastas as perhaps the best example of what it means to do theology in the region. Rastas, for the most part, are avid students of the NT and the Bible in general, so any examination of their contribution to theology in the region that ignores their use of the canonical writings cannot, in my view, be taken very seriously. The fact that Rastafari hermeneutics may be considered partial and provisional does not necessarily count against it, since such, more or less, is also true of the predominantly North Atlantic strain of hermeneutics that has dominated the Caribbean basin. D. Background. The first and only official study of Rastafari was commissioned by the then head of the University College of the West Indies, later the University of the West Indies, UWI, W. Arthur Lewis, at the request of the de facto leader of the movement, Mortimer Plano. The study, first presented to the government of Jamaica, covered briefly the history, growth, and philosophy of the movement, but lacked any reference to its creative linguistic expression. The first work to attempt a comprehensive analysis of the language of Rastas was done by Joshua Pert, now adjunct professor of education at the Jamaica Theological Seminary. His stated objective was to investigate the relationship among the English language, Jamaican Creole, and what he called dread talk. After briefly outlining the evolution of Rastafari, Pert stated that it is uncertain how long after the inception of the movement this distinct way of speaking, that is, dread talk, developed, just as it is difficult to say at precisely what time French or Spanish began to break away from Latin, or what time they became separate languages. In exploring the relation between Jamaican Creole and dread talk, Pert observed that the two linguistic phenomena are so close that the line between them is blurred in some areas, and much sharper in others. The genetic relationship between dread talk and English, however, is much more definable. In seeking to answer the question as to whether dread talk is a language or a dialect, Peart concluded that it is a dialect of Jamaican Creole, with the caveat that Rastas do not use pure Creole because it has been influenced by imperialist, colonialist mentality and subjugation. The unique feature of dread talk, Peart further observed, is its creative employment of the pronominal I. Less than a decade later, Pollard published a programmatic and linguistically sophisticated paper as part of a symposium on Rastafari. Her focus was upon the lexical items of dread talk, particularly the distinctive pronominal form. Pollard classifies dread talk under three main categories. In the first category, we have known items bearing new meanings. For example, the term forward becomes in dread talk leave in the sentence, I man a forward. The second category, observes Pollard, encompasses words that bear the weight of their phonological implications with some explanations. For instance, the English oppress morphs into downpress, as in the sentence, Weda di man di black ar wait anim downpress me now is still siem a abon, whether the man is black or white and he oppresses me, I am still the one suffering. Pollard summarizes the third category thus: the pronoun I of SJE, Standard Jamaican English, gives place to me in JC, Jamaican Creole, and is glossed as I, my, mine, me, according to the context. It is this I of SJE that has become the predominant sound in Rastafarian language, though its implications are far more extensive than the simple SJE pronoun I could ever bear. She was to provide a more detailed description of dread talk in a monograph that was later revised, using the same basic categories. Drawing upon the work of Pollard and Siobhan, Homiak's essay seeks to reconstruct the earliest years of ians, the category of lexicon which has become the predominant and most creative aspect of Rastafari language. He concedes, along with Siobhan, that a detailed account of the subject is virtually impossible to delineate at present, and that dread talk, particularly the distinctive employment of I, is historically continuous with the folk penchant for punning and experimentation with language. Another stage in the development of I talk is traceable to members of the I-agelic house, who in the 50s were among the first to use the self-reflexive nominative case, which has now become the lexical hallmark of the movement. This, affirms Homiak, would reflect the obvious influence of the Bible. He then cites a first-hand account of what may turn out to be the best recollection of how the colorful linguistic expression came about. The speaker is one I rice, icons, and de creator speak to I and I through the Spirit and fix a new tongue in the latter days. And the Creator speaks to me through the Spirit and establishes a new language in the latter days. McFarlane's contribution to another of the most authoritative symposia to date is an attempt to analyze the distinctive pronominal against the backdrop of popular Jamaican culture loosely within the framework of Western philosophy. Rasta I words, asserts McFarlane, form a well-knit semantic and lexical family structure. Within this linguistic framework, Rastas are able to simultaneously resist the culture of subservience imposed on those of African descent, as well as affirm their new epistemological paradigm in contradistinction to that of a dominant Western brand. I in the New Testament. Some recent perspectives. Even though all people on planet Earth, as far as we can verify, use the word I and its equivalents, the meanings invested in that word in the various social systems of the world are often radically different. The way people deal with the self can be plotted on a line whose extreme axes are individualism, awareness of a unique and totally independent I, on the one hand, and collectivism, awareness of an I that has nearly everything in common with the kinship group and its spin-offs. While it is relatively easy to determine where the NT writers fall on Molina's continuum, most likely the collectivist, this generalization cannot be used to prejudge the meaning of such a challenging passage like Romans 7, as even a cursory review of its history of interpretation will show. The most extensive overview of the I statements in the Gospels, as far as I am aware, is still the article by Stouffer. Stouffer makes the insightful observation that divine I declarations in the NT are extremely rare, being limited for the most part to quotations from the OT. In contrast, one finds ego on the lips of Jesus, where normally a divine utterance is expected. This is characteristically true of the I speeches of Matthew 5. Other significant instances, according to Stouffer, are Matthew 11:28, where Jesus occupies a central place between God and us, and Luke 22:32, where this mediatorial position is played out on behalf of a disciple. Stouffer sees the Gospel of John taking the I statements to a different level in presenting Christ in special relation to the Father, 8:29-42, 10:30-38. He also mentions the 7 or so I statements: Christ is light, bread, vine, door, road, truth, life, which characterize the uniqueness of his person and significance for the human race. The absolute use of the I am predication, for example, John 8:24, receives special focus as a derivative of OT passages like Exodus 3:14, Deuteronomy 32:39, and Isaiah 41:4. This borrowing of OT passages is also reflected in the Apocalypse, in which the main focus of the I statements is the union between God and Christ. Yet another useful study is that of Seiichi Yagi. Although the author's main purpose was to provide an interpretive framework within which to understand the thought of Takezawa Katsumi as an aid to promote dialogue between Buddhists and Christians, he nonetheless offers an insightful examination of the Christological I speeches. The backdrop for this is Katsumi's distinction of what is termed primary and secondary contacts with God. The first is the unconditional fact that God is with each of us, no matter what we have done, even though we are usually ignorant of this unity lying at the very ground of the self. When the self is awakened to this fact, it now becomes possible for it to live in conscious accord with the will of God. Jesus and Buddha, according to Katsumi, attained secondary contact with God, with the former so thoroughly and completely that he became the model for ourselves. What Jesus was for the Hebrews, Gautama Buddha was for the Indian tradition. Yagi registers unqualified agreement with Katsumi's perspective, including the notion that the ground of salvation is the primary contact of God with the self. Yagi then goes on to survey the scholarly investigation of the synoptic traditions and the varied responses to the question concerning Jesus' messianic consciousness in the last 50 years. He observes that many scholars during this period who employed form criticism denied that Jesus understood himself as Son of Man, Messiah, though he spoke and acted with unparalleled authority which surpassed even that of Moses. Yagi continues, but unless I am mistaken, none of these scholars inquire deeply into the meaning of I, of such statements of Jesus as, but I say. This I has many levels of meaning. We can ask then just what the I in the words of Jesus really means. Yagi then went on to explore Jesus' I speeches in the Synoptics and the Gospel of John before comparing them with certain features of Zen Buddhism. An important contribution of both Yagi and Stouffer is their treatment of Paul's I statements in parallel with those of Jesus. But neither writer sought to explain the relation between the two sets of pronominal declaratives. As was noted earlier, one of the differences NT interpreters face is to identify Paul's reference in his use of ego in Romans 7:14. Is it Paul before conversion? Is it Paul as a Christian struggling in his own power apart from the Spirit's help? Or indeed, is it Paul the Christian even with the Spirit's help? Is the I merely a literary projection whose real reference is Israel and her experience with the law? It is Douglas Moo who gives a qualified yes to the last question by combining it with the autobiographical view. For him, ego in Romans 7 is the writer in solidarity with Israel. In support of this, Moo cites certain OT passages where the pronominal first person is used for the capital, Jerusalem, or for the entire nation. For example, Jeremiah 10:19-22, Micah 7:7-10, etc., as well as the structure of Romans 7:9-10, vis-a-vis the OT accounts of the giving of the law. Moo's position, though argued with plausibility, is somewhat subtle, and one doubts that the original audience would have made such connection. B. Dodd broadens the investigation by demonstrating how the apostle's use of ego through most of his epistles is tied to his desire to exemplify certain Christian virtues. More than that, the apostle's use of I served often to illustrate and consolidate his arguments with some rhetorical flourish. In other words, Paul's personal references demonstrate his skill as a teacher rather than any tendency toward being autobiographical. Dodd's work, like that of Lyons and Chase below, has the advantage of being a monograph which gives him ample space to develop his thesis, one that I find quite persuasive. I hope to build on this by highlighting an important dimension of Paul's presentation in Romans 7 and 15, chapters that figure very little in Dodd's work. Another feature that Dodd downplays is the occasional autobiographical character of Paul's self-references. The opposite view is shared by Lyons, who marshaled a spirited defense of Paul's employment of the autobiographical genre. In contrast to those scholars who embrace the widely held assumption that Paul writes autobiographically only infrequently, incidentally, reluctantly, and almost apologetically, Lyons offers a fairly thorough research of the apostle's personal remarks against the background of similar references in antiquity. Working from Galatians and 1 Thessalonians, two of Paul's earliest letters, Lyons concludes that certain features of the writer's autobiographical statements parallel that of ancient philosophers who claim to be an embodiment of their own philosophies. For example, in Galatians, various strands of the evidence come together to support the conclusion that Paul presents his autobiography as a paradigm of the gospel of Christian freedom, which he seeks to persuade his readers to reaffirm in the face of the threat presented by the troublemakers. Despite the close identification between Paul and his message, he remains subject to the gospel. This tantalizing study, unfortunately, does not treat Romans 7 at all. However, its usefulness in the other areas cannot be ignored. Another study that is quite relevant to my own investigation is Che's Paul, an apostle to the Gentiles. Quite apart from its focus on chapter 15, the chapter that Che feels is most crucial in understanding why Paul wrote the letter, I am very much interested in how Che develops the theme encapsulated in his subtitle, his apostolic self-awareness and its influence on the soteriological argument in Romans. Che makes the observation that Paul's apostolic self-awareness in respect of his theology remains substantially undeveloped. He then goes on to argue convincingly, in my view, that the apostle's self-awareness has strongly influenced his affirmation of the equality of Jew and Gentile soteriologically, and had even affected his rhetoric. What I hope to show is that the same apostolic self-awareness is also expressed soteriologically in a slightly different way, one that is complementary to Che's own thesis. Bage's proposal in his interpretation of Romans 7 is that Paul's language is dominated by Hebrew thought patterns. With this hypothesis in mind, Bage seeks as much as possible to discover Semitic equivalents for that which is formulated in the original language of Paul's letter to the Romans. Justification for this approach is seen in the notion that Paul was divinely called as a prophet to all nations, including Israel. Seen in this light, the apostle's ministry should be viewed as in direct succession with those of Isaiah and Jeremiah. Bage's thesis, though interesting, remains unconvincing, despite the fact that he has provided linguistic equivalents for virtually every term in Romans 7. I hope to explore some of these equivalents with a view to strengthening my own reading of the controversial chapter. I will argue that Paul's I affirmations constitute another way of employing weakness language, a language that is well illustrated elsewhere in the Pauline corpus, as well as in the Hebrew scriptures familiar to the apostle. What follows immediately is a historical overview of Rastafari as a movement, succeeded by a linguistic analysis of the pertinent dominical sayings in their narrative framework, as recorded by the evangelists themselves.